Why women become curious after emotional distance. Most men think attraction disappears the moment a woman pulls away. So they panic. They start texting more, explaining more, trying harder, watching her behavior constantly. And without realizing it, they destroy the exact thing that could have rebuilt attraction in the first place. Because attraction does not always disappear when distance appears. Sometimes distance is the first moment attraction becomes emotionally noticeable again. And most men completely misunderstand why. One of the biggest mistakes men make is assuming constant presence automatically creates emotional connection. It doesn't. In fact, when your attention becomes too predictable, too available, too emotionally constant, your presence stops creating emotional impact. You become expected. And once someone becomes emotionally expected, the brain stops processing them with intensity. This is why many men slowly become invisible inside relationships without realizing it. Not because they are bad men, not because they lack value, but because emotional familiarity replaced emotional awareness. People rarely notice something deeply while it is constantly in front of them. They notice it when its absence creates contrast. And that applies strongly to attraction, because attraction is deeply connected to emotional perception, not logical effort, not constant reassurance. Perception. The moment a man starts chasing after distance appears, he changes the emotional dynamic immediately. Now the relationship becomes centered around fear. Fear of losing her, fear of silence, fear of uncertainty. And women can feel that emotional shift very quickly, because desperation changes behavior fast. Suddenly, his messages feel heavier. His reactions become emotional. His energy becomes anxious. His attention becomes excessive. And instead of rebuilding attraction, it creates pressure. What many men fail to understand is this. Curiosity grows in space, not an emotional overload. When someone constantly has access to your attention, your thoughts, your reactions, and your emotional state, there is nothing left for the mind to wonder about. Everything becomes fully available, fully readable, fully processed. And once something feels fully processed emotionally, curiosity drops. But distance interrupts emotional certainty. Now the brain starts asking questions again. What changed? Why does his energy feel different now? Why isn't he reacting the same way anymore? And those questions matter psychologically, because the brain naturally focuses on unresolved patterns, not resolved ones. This is why emotional distance can suddenly make someone more mentally noticeable. Not because distance itself is magical, but because it creates emotional contrast. And contrast forces attention. A man who is constantly available every second then suddenly becomes calmer, more focused, less reactive, creates a completely different emotional experience. Now, she starts observing him differently, not because he manipulated anything, but because his emotional energy changed. And emotional shifts are powerful, especially when they break expectations. Most men don't realize how much attraction depends on emotional tension. Not toxic tension, not confusion, not hot and cold games, but psychological tension, the kind that comes from uncertainty, emotional independence, and unpredictability in emotional availability. Because when everything becomes emotionally guaranteed, attention weakens. This is why some women become more curious after distance. Distance forces emotional reevaluation, and reevaluation changes perception. Suddenly she starts remembering your presence, your energy, your attention, your behavior, the emotional feeling around you, things she ignored when they were constantly available. This is also why chasing usually backfires after someone pulls away, because chasing removes emotional space completely. And without space, there is no reevaluation, only emotional pressure. Calmness, however, creates a completely different effect. When a man stays emotionally grounded during distance, it communicates something powerful psychologically. It shows emotional stability, self-control, independence, internal confidence, and those traits naturally create attraction. not because they are performed, but because they are rare. Most people react emotionally when uncertainty appears. So when someone remains calm instead of desperate, it stands out immediately. And what stands out emotionally gets remembered. Another thing most men misunderstand is this. Women are extremely sensitive to emotional energy shifts. They notice when attention becomes forced. They notice when behavior becomes approval-seeking. They notice when a man's emotional state starts depending on their response. And once that happens, attraction changes. Because emotional dependence changes perception. But when a man maintains his center emotionally, even during distance, his presence feels different. Now, his attention feels intentional instead of desperate. His silence feels calm instead of manipulative. His space feels natural instead of emotional punishment. And that difference matters a lot. This is why emotional distance often reveals the real emotional dynamic between two people. Because once constant interaction disappears, all that remains is emotional impact. And emotional impact is what determines whether curiosity grows or disappears completely. Attraction is rarely about effort alone. It is about emotional experience. How someone feels around you. How your presence affects their emotions. How your absence affects their emotions. And many men never think about the second part. Sometimes a woman only fully notices a man's emotional presence after space appears. Not because she enjoys losing him, but because emotional familiarity had numbed the emotional impact while he was constantly there. Distance removes that numbness, and awareness returns. This is why emotionally grounded men often create stronger long-term attraction, because they do not react impulsively to emotional shifts. They do not panic the moment attention changes. They do not destroy their own emotional presence trying to force certainty. They stay centered, and centered energy always feels different. At the end of the day, curiosity after emotional distance is not really about absence itself. It's about what absence does psychologically. Because when someone is constantly present in your life, constantly texting, constantly reacting, constantly available, your brain slowly stops treating their presence as emotionally significant. Not because they have no value, but because the human mind adapts very quickly to emotional consistency. What is constantly available eventually starts feeling emotionally normal. And once something feels normal for too long, people stop consciously noticing its emotional effect on them. This happens in relationships all the time. A woman may genuinely care about a man, enjoy his attention, enjoy his presence. But because he is always there emotionally, she stops actively processing how much emotional impact he actually has. His attention becomes expected. His reassurance becomes expected. His effort becomes expected. An expectation lowers emotional intensity. But when distance appears, something changes mentally. Now the emotional pattern is interrupted. An interruption forces awareness. Suddenly, the brain notices the absence of what it previously adapted to. Now, she starts thinking differently. Not because she planned to, not because she consciously wants to, but because emotional contrast activates attention again. And attention is the beginning of curiosity. This is why emotional distance can suddenly make a man feel more emotionally visible. Because now she is no longer reacting to constant presence. Now she is reacting to contrast, to change, to uncertainty. And uncertainty naturally increases mental focus. The brain wants to understand what changed. It wants to resolve emotional ambiguity. That is why emotionally unresolved situations replay in people's minds so often. Because unresolved emotional patterns create psychological tension. And psychological tension keeps attention active. Most men completely destroy this process by panicking emotionally. The moment they feel distance, they try to force reconnection immediately. More texts, more explanations, more emotional reactions, more attempts to regain certainty. But certainty is not always attractive emotionally, especially when it comes from fear, because fear changes behavior. And once fear enters a man's energy, women usually feel it quickly. Now his attention no longer feels calm. It feels emotionally dependent. Now his communication no longer feels natural. It feels emotionally urgent. And urgency changes attraction. What creates curiosity after distance is usually not the distance alone. It is the emotional composure during the distance. That is what most men fail to understand. Because when a man remains emotionally grounded, even after emotional space appears, he communicates something very powerful without speaking. He communicates self-respect, emotional control, confidence, stability, non-neediness, and those traits create emotional intrigue naturally. Not because they are manipulative, but because they are emotionally uncommon. Most people become reactive under uncertainty. So when someone remains centered instead of emotionally collapsing, it immediately changes how others perceive them. And perception is everything in attraction. Not effort alone, not words alone. Perception. The way someone emotionally experiences your presence. The way they emotionally experience your absence. The way your energy affects their nervous system. These things matter far more than most men realize. This is why some women suddenly become curious after emotional distance. Not because distance magically creates love, but because space removes emotional overstimulation and forces emotional reevaluation. Now, she can actually feel the emotional contrast. Now she notices a shift. Now she becomes aware of what your presence actually meant emotionally. And awareness changes everything. The truth is, many men never give attraction space to breathe. They become so focused on maintaining constant emotional access that they accidentally remove mystery, tension, and emotional contrast completely. Everything becomes predictable, emotionally processed, mentally settled, and settled emotions rarely create deep curiosity. But when emotional distance appears naturally, and a man responds with calmness instead of desperation, his entire emotional presence changes. Now he no longer feels emotionally dependent on the outcome, and that alone creates a different kind of attraction, because emotional independence always feels powerful. Not loud, not dramatic, quietly powerful. And sometimes, that quiet emotional control becomes the exact thing a woman cannot stop thinking about later. Because calmness under emotional pressure is rare, very rare, and rare emotional experiences stay in the mind longer than ordinary ones ever do.